Hello, and welcome to the closing session of AJC Virtual Global Forum 2021. My name is Belle Yoeli, and I'm AJC's Chief Communications and Innovation Officer. It's my privilege to be in conversation today with a lifelong Jewish activist, my boss and mentor, AJC CEO David Harris. David, as always, it's great to be with you.
And with you, Belle.
Over the past 4 days of AJC Virtual Global Forum, thousands of people have tuned in from across the United States and more than 40 countries. We've heard from world leaders, policymakers, civic and student leaders, and we've debated and discussed some of the most pressing issues facing the Jewish people and the world. Our theme has been reimagining what's possible, and after the past few days, I'm sure you can all understand why. Our program has reaffirmed that while we face many challenges, we do not have to accept the status quo. Together, it is possible to envision and create a better world. And on that note, David, there's a lot I want to ask you, so let's jump right in. As you look back on the past 4 days, David, we of course can't discuss everything, but what were some of the highlights for you? What are the important takeaways? What do you want the audience to remember? Perhaps beginning with the lineup of the speakers.
Well, perhaps, Belle, beginning with the staff, because what our audience saw over the last 4 days was the outcome of months and months of effort on the part of many staff colleagues who put a lot of love and a lot of professionalism into this, and I'd like to give a public shout out to my staff colleagues. I think this year's Global Forum has tried to capture what in German is called the Zeitgeist, the spirit of our times, and I think we succeeded in doing it. So the first takeaway is I think we captured the moment. We capture what's on the minds of so many people, and I think that helps explain why so many thousands of people across America and around the world tuned in to watch. Secondly, I'm very proud of the overarching theme, reimagine what's possible. As you said in your opening comment, this is not a time to reaffirm the status quo. This is a time rather to imagine what is possible. And I think that we displayed in the course of 4 days the fact that we can be authors of history. We can change things for the better. And we saw a lot of examples of that, particularly in a couple of areas. One, in reimagining the Middle East. Yes, to be sure, there are lots of serious challenges in the Middle East. Some were on display as recently as a few weeks ago when Hamas launched another war against Israel. But at the same time, we hosted the foreign ministers of the UAE and Bahrain, the ambassadors of Morocco and Sudan. We had a high-level Muslim-Jewish discussion between religious leaders. We had another important conversation between young leaders from Morocco and Israel. There's an awful lot going on, and it's very encouraging. I think we also made some very important announcements, and I hope we'll get to that in the course of the conversation, because those announcements are going to outlive the Global Forum. They're telling the world that we're thinking as creatively as we possibly can about next steps. I think people will also remember some of the very special moments, like the scintillating conversation among Bret Stephens, Barry Weiss, and Simone Rodin on the state of anti-Semitism. And there's so much more. You know, I'm almost reluctant to go down this slope because I know that I won't include everything. But I think we capture the domestic and international themes. I think we brought to our audience some of the highest level and most thoughtful speakers and leaders of our time. And I think that we were willing to both confront the challenges and problems, but also highlight the opportunities and progress that have been made. So that, in sum, for me, is what this Global Forum has been. And now the work begins again, post-Global Forum.
Thank you, David. And we, of course, will talk about the work after Global Forum. But I want to follow up on one thing that you just said. You highlighted several of the speakers, and especially speakers from the Middle East and the Arab world. Can you put that into context for us in terms of AJC's priorities? I know you talk a lot about having certain priorities in the 21st century, and I think it's important for our viewers to understand that.
So to step back for a moment, for those who are newer to AJC, AJC is what we'd like to call an audaciously ambitious organization. We're not just thinking about the next tweet or the next press release. We're thinking about big ideas audaciously and how we can try and help author history. And in the 20th century, the first century of AJC's existence, there were really three ways in which we highlighted those big ideas for me. One is embarking on an effort to expand the promise of America for more and more of its citizens, including but not limited to Jews, at a time in the early 20th century when that opportunity was really quite limited and stratified. The second area was in Christian-Jewish relations, and especially in Catholic-Jewish relations, to see whether we could write a new chapter, a brighter chapter, in relations between Christians and Jews after, 1900 years of serious, very serious challenges. And the third challenge arose as a result of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and that was, after the war, what to do about Germany. Germany remained a powerful country in the center of Europe. It would have a future. AJC took on all three of these issues: the promise of America, the challenge of helping galvanize a revolution in Christian-Jewish relations, and the path of charting a new relationship with post-war Germany. Now we're in the 21st century, and I would say that once again AJC has three overarching challenges, and all of them were reflected in this year's Global Forum. The first challenge is, again, the promise of America. As we've been reminded in recent months and years, much as we've made enormous progress in this country, we're not quite there yet. There's much that remains to be done. And that's why it was so important in our Global Forum that we focused on the search for bipartisanship, the announcement of the U.S. Senate Black Jewish Caucus, the emphasis on the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council. The second area where we're focusing is on trying to contribute to peace between Israel and the Arab world. Again, much has been done, and I'm proud of AJC's role over the last 30 years, but much remains to be done. But I think we have momentum now, and prospects look quite good. And the third is, having helped achieve a revolution in Christian-Jewish relations last century, can we spark a similar revolution in Muslim-Jewish relations in the 21st century? Those are our three primary goals, and all three were reflected in this year's Global Forum.
Thank you, David, for that important context. I want to follow up with one more thing specifically about the program details, because you were modest about it. The reality is, for those of us who I think are used to AJC, we might have gotten accustomed to having the President of France, the President of the European Commission, and senior officials from the Arab world perhaps at our Global Forum. But the fact of the matter is, for those of us on staff who work on this conference and who go back and do research on our past conferences in preparation for Global Forum, you see this year after year. Going back to the 1990s, world leaders join AJC Global Forum, senior U.S. officials join AJC Global Forum. I'd like our viewers to understand, how is this possible? Why is it that these world leaders come to speak to us? And why is this significant?
Well, I hope its significance speaks for itself, because what it really says is those who are part of the AJC community have a platform, and that platform allows all of us to engage with the world's decision makers. That doesn't mean it's an endorsement of each and every leader, but it is to say that if we're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, defending democratic values, advancing understanding of Israel, contributing to peace in the region, we have to be talking to the people who count, the people who are going to make the decisions that affect our very future. And I think AJC, I may argue, more than any other Jewish organization on the planet that I know, and more than most NGOs generally, has consistently been able to reach those top leaders. And not just one or two, but look at the program of 2021. As you mentioned, Bell, the President of France, the President of the European Union Commission, the President of Israel, the President of Kosovo, foreign ministers, ambassadors, U.S. senators, U.S. members of Congress, members of the Biden administration. And then you can say, well, maybe that's a fluke. But go back to 2020. We had the Chancellor of Germany, the Foreign Minister and Defense Minister of Germany. We had the Prime Minister of Greece, the Prime Minister of Albania. We had the Defense Minister of Israel. We had the Secretary of State of the United States, and we had the future Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo and Tony Blinken. And I can go on and on. And no, these are not sort of whimsical letters that we write to world leaders and say, would you consider speaking to the AJC Global Forum? And no, we don't go to speakers bureaus and say, how do we get so-and-so? Each and every one of the relationships on display in the Global Forum this year and in previous years is the product of months and years and often decades of investment, both in the personal relationship and in the relationship with the country or the institution. So these are not flukes. This is very much the AJC business plan. Identify American and world leaders, seek to engage them, establish trust, establish credibility, and then build on that. So in seeing, for example, the French president, one has to understand AJC has been investing in our relationship with France since after the Second World War when we opened an office in Paris. And I can go on and on and on, but each of them reflects the AJC unique style of diplomacy. Build relationships for the long haul. And that's what people, I hope, have seen during this and previous global forums.
Thank you, David. And, in thinking about the speakers who come to talk to us, I know you're always very focused on not just the content and putting on a show, but really the output, the outcome over the output of Global Forum itself. And you mentioned some of those outcomes, and I'd like to give you a chance to highlight any others, but also you referenced special announcements, and there were many throughout the conference. And if I know you, maybe you have another one or two up your sleeve. So I'm curious about that as well.
Well, I'll try and remember the outcomes because there were many significant ones, but among them was, first of all, the announcement by AJC that we are now opening an office in the UAE. This is the AJC's 13th office overseas, our first in the Arab world, and I believe that that's a historic moment. We also introduced the audience to the first director, the founding director, if you will, of that office in the UAE. And he himself has a very distinguished diplomatic pedigree, having served as the U.S. ambassador to neighboring Oman for years, and having previously served in the region in a variety of Arab countries, not to mention in Turkey and in Israel. So we're absolutely thrilled about that. Secondly, we announced that AJC, beginning this week, is launching an AJC Farsi or AJC Persian communications effort on Instagram, on Twitter, through videos on YouTube to reach a Farsi or Persian-speaking audience both in Iran and around the world. And it follows on the extraordinary success of our AJC Arabic initiatives, which have been seen by literally tens of millions of people, whether on YouTube or on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram. We're determined to engage in a direct conversation. We don't want third parties to get in the way, third parties being others who don't have the shared interest in expanding communications and expanding understanding in direct contact between us and Arabic-speaking people, us and Farsi-speaking people. We extend our hand in friendship and in peace. So again, very exciting. We also talked about expanding AJC's Project Interchange, which for the last 30 years or more has brought world leaders to Israel to see Israel for themselves and not through the prism again of third parties like the media. We've brought over 6,000 world leaders to Israel. Now we're expanding it to say we want to bring people from the Arab world to Israel, and we want to bring people that we're taking to Israel onward to one or more of the Arab countries that have normalized relations with Israel, because we want to be a net contributor to deepening and expanding the peace. We also announced that we are taking a classic book, The Children of Abraham, a primer about Jews and Judaism for the Muslim world, a book that was first written for AJC some 20 years ago by Dr. Reuven Firestone. We're updating it, and we're going to make it available in up to 6 different languages that are widely spoken throughout the Muslim world. Arabic, Urdu, Farsi, Turkish, Bengali, and Indonesian language, so that we will literally make available to hundreds of millions of people, if not more than 1 billion people, knowledge about Jews and Judaism which they otherwise could not get. Amidst all of the propaganda and all of the hype and all of the tropes that are too often out there, we want again to have a direct conversation. I'm also thrilled by the announcement of Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the influential Organization of American States, that following the European model and after extensive conversations with AJC, he announced that they will be appointing a commissioner to monitor and combat anti-Semitism among the 35 nations of Latin America under the umbrella of the OAS. And this is another remarkable development in the fight against anti-Semitism. We need partners, and now we will have the partnership of the Organization of American States in fighting anti-Semitism. And he said so much more. Here in the United States, we made another, what I believe to be, historic announcement. In 2019, from the AJC stage, the House Black Jewish Caucus was announced. Now, 2 years later, on this virtual stage, it was announced that the U.S. Senate will follow the House example. And Senators Rosen, Booker, and Scott collectively announced the creation of the Senate Black Jewish Caucus, something that's very much needed, and we were very proud to be associated with it. So I can keep going, Bell, but these were some of the great highlights. And yes, there are some more to come. One thing I'd like to announce at this moment is that in 2022, next year, we're going to be leaving the virtual format, we hope, if everything cooperates, and returning to Washington, D.C., which has been the normal venue for the AJC Global Forum. So we invite our entire audience to consider joining us in person in Washington in 2022. And a year later in 2023, coinciding with Israel's 75th anniversary of its rebirth, we are taking the AJC Global Forum back to Israel, as we did in 2018. We're very excited, and we think it's especially important, Bell, to announce it now, in the wake of the Hamas-launched war against Israel, in order to once again underscore and reaffirm AJC's enduring commitment to Israel, our total shoulder-to-shoulder solidarity, and that's why we're expecting another large audience in Israel to be there for the Global Forum, to bring their families, to see and experience Israel for themselves. And finally, since I have 2 sleeves, and you mentioned both sleeves, I'm also very pleased to announce another important AJC breakthrough. One of the themes of this year's Global Forum and past Global Forums has been the challenges facing young Jews, young friends of Israel, on campuses. We had a really powerful program with students from the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania, for example, speaking about their challenges on campus as proud Jews and as committed friends of Israel. In 2018, at the Jerusalem Global Forum, one of our great lay leaders, Gail Binderman, stood on stage with her son and her daughter and announced in the name of her late father's foundation, the Norman E. Alexander Family G Foundation, a $5 million gift at the time for our young leadership programs, including bringing young leaders to our global forums and helping our high school program, Leaders for Tomorrow, to strengthen. Now, on behalf of the foundation, of which Gail is the president, she has made another substantial gift on top of that original $5 million commitment, the result of which is that we will be naming our Young Leadership Department, which includes our high school, our college, and our post-college programs, in honor and memory of her father, and calling it the Norman E. Alexander Family G Foundation Young Leadership Department, or for short, the Alexander Young Leadership Department. For everyone who's concerned about the Jewish future, Gail has set a remarkable example for stepping up, stepping forward, and saying, Hineni, here I am, in memory of her father, and recognizing that this is the front line of Jewish advocacy. So thank you, Gail, for again setting an example. We're thrilled to launch this department in memory of your father's name, and we expect great things to come of it.
Well, David, I'm overwhelmed by both of those announcements, and obviously very excited to go back to Israel for our global forum, and about this really important investment in young leadership. And I think both of those pieces speak to, the darker side in terms of what we're discussing in this conversation, which is the challenges. So I don't want to take us from positive to negative, but I think we need to talk about them in this moment. And of course, our viewers need to hear from you. Global Forum is ending, and as you said, there's a lot of work to do. And I know I and many in the Jewish community are concerned and looking for guidance with the backdrop of the trauma of all the elements surrounding the conflict in Israel, both the violence initiated by Hamas itself and the response on social media and in the media that seems worse than ever before. And then we have the spike in anti-Semitism piece. And AJC is on the front lines on all of these issues, but I think everyone is kind of wondering, what do we do with this ground shift? Where do we go from here? What are your thoughts, David?
Well, let me frame it firstly, Belle, in just a brief anecdote, which some of the viewers may have heard before, but which I think is really apt for this part of the conversation, because it really speaks to AJC's sort of purpose in life, our mission, and the way we view the world. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes was called to a case in the north of England, and together with his trusted aide, Watson, they went off in their horse and buggy. But the trip required an overnight stay, so they stopped in an open field and they pitched a tent, and they unfurled their sleeping bags and they slept side by side in the tent. In the middle of the night, Holmes suddenly woke up. He looked around and he elbowed Watson and he said, "Watson, my good man, what do you see?" And Watson took a moment to open his eyes and rub the sleep out, and then he said, "Holmes, I see the transcendence of time, the majesty of the universe, the extraordinary possibilities of life itself." And Holmes said to him, "Watson, cut the poetry. Someone has stolen our tent." And I think if we want to capture the mission of AJC, especially at a moment in time like this, we have to keep one eye, Belle, focused laser-like on the possibilities, the majesty of the universe, the big ideas, the transformative ideas, the kind of ideas we've talked about earlier in this conversation. And yet, on the other hand, with that second eye, we've got to be very mindful of the fact that someone is trying to steal our tent. And that tent represents our security, our stability, the warmth of our home. So my first answer is we need to be bifocal. We can never give up believing in the possibilities. We can never go into a defensive crouch, simply fending off our enemies, though we have enemies and we have to address it. On the other hand, we can't become so consumed with the challenges of the moment as to abandon that larger agenda which says we can transform Muslim-Jewish relations. We can contribute to peace between Israel and its neighbors. We can strengthen America's commitment to its promise for all. So we're on a dual track. That's number one. But more specifically, what happened in Israel should be a reminder of the challenges that we face in trying to explain and interpret Israel to many who either have never been there, can't imagine what life is really like because they've simply been poisoned by some of the ugliness of social media, or the celebrities or others who are depicting Israel in a demonic way, completely devoid of reality for anyone who's even spent 5 minutes in the country of Israel. We have our work cut out for us. Is it impossible? Absolutely not. For one thing, there were 30 countries that stood by Israel in the last war and did so with extraordinary moral clarity and moral courage. And I urge people who have not yet seen the film that we showed in the opening session to do so. And I've seen that it's become extremely popular on social media, by the way. Maybe not quite as popular as the celebrity posts, but people are watching it and people are taking note of who those 30 countries are. But we've got lots of other countries, we've got lots of politicians, we've got some journalists, we've got some celebrities who don't know the truth. Maybe Project Interchange can get some of them to Israel. Maybe we can reach some of them, as I did recently in an exchange with Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist. But Israel is a great cause. I'm proud to defend Israel, as I have all my life. And I believe that AJC has the credibility, it has the chops, the policy chops to do so in an effective way. And then we have the problem of surging anti-Semitism, and I would commend to those who may not have seen it, that extraordinarily powerful session with Barry Weiss, Brett Stevens, and AJC's own Simone Rodin, because they tackled this issue very directly. They diagnosed it clearly. They pointed fingers where fingers were needed, and they charted some paths forward. And I agree with them. I agree with them, number one, we must be swivel-headed when it comes to anti-Semitism. AJC has been saying this for the last 20 years, often alone, while some other Jewish organizations refused to recognize the need for swivel-headedness and instead focused on only one source of anti-Semitism. But we have to come to grips with the fact, and the last month or 6 weeks has shown that the anti-Semitism comes not only from the far right, the radical right. We know that. It's recognizable. It's familiar. They don't hide it. We also have to deal with the far left, which tends to mask it. And we have to deal with this very peculiar alliance that we first saw in Europe, and now we see here between the jihadist elements and the far left. And of course, what makes it odd? Well, the fact that if the far left ever lived under jihadist rule, they would be around for probably 5 minutes, if that, before they'd be crushed. And yet they find common cause in their obsessive hatred for Israel, for Zionism, for Jews who are seen as extensions of Israel, for synagogues that are seen also as surrogates for Israel. So we've got to call it out, number one. Number two, we have to insist that our political leadership across the board, I think Simone Rodin used the term the political class, that our political leadership give no space to its condemnation of any form of anti-Semitism, and not just as a tweet or as a press release, but as a policy. Because without the support of political leadership in this country, as we also learned from our European experience, it's going to be very tough going. We need our leaders to take this seriously and send a clear message: zero tolerance. Number three, we need to expect the same of our institutions, our high schools, our colleges, our universities, NGOs, and others. Anti-Semitism should not be an afterthought. Anti-Semitism should not be rationalized or legitimized or justified, much less denied. Anti-Semitism should not always be lumped together with every other ism and phobia, as if there is not a specificity to anti-Semitism, as if people never learned anything from the history of the Jews and the history of the world. And number four, we have to prepare our children and our grandchildren for the fact that, one, they should be proud Jews. Two, they should be proud supporters of the state of Israel. And three, they should be prepared to stand up for what they believe in, not back down, not cower, not be intimidated, because they may be facing some difficult situations, whether in a high school classroom, in a college dorm, in a university quad, wherever it may be. And AJC, with the help of Gail Binderman and the Norman Alexander Family Foundation, has been really focused on helping to prepare young people through our LIFT program. And I hope those who may not be familiar with Leaders for Tomorrow will learn more about it, because it's a way of preparing our children to be effective Jewish ambassadors and advocates.
Thank you, David. I know we do have to wrap up, and it's hard to believe that the Global Forum is coming to a close. I think you've really made the case quite clear here, but I want to give you the opportunity to just sum it up and in expressing the urgency of this moment and really what we're facing, in addition to continuing to dream big and reimagine what's possible. Why AJC? It's clear to me, as a young Jew, committed professional Jew, I've dedicated my career to working in AJC. But to everyone watching, why get involved? Why support AJC specifically in this time, in this moment?
Well, first of all, let me be very personal, because something happened to me this week that deeply touched me. My granddaughter was one of 11 graduates, if you will, of nursery school. And I was watching the ceremony at the Chabad school, and I saw these 11 beautiful, innocent, eager, enthusiastic children, Jews who learned to celebrate Shabbat, Jews who learned to bake challah, Jews who learned to say the prayers, 4- and 5-year-old children. And I looked at them, and in a way, I have to say, I was madly in love, but I also wanted to cry, because I know what may await them. It's what you raised a few moments ago, Belle. It's what Jews in New York and Los Angeles experienced. It's what Jews in Toronto and London just experienced. I think that we, who are watching this program, who are involved with Jewish life, who are involved in AJC, we have an obligation to those 4- and 5-year-old children, and to Jewish children across the country and around the world, to bequeath to them the safety and security of being a Jew, the pride and knowledge of being a Jew. We should never, ever resort to becoming a Marano Jew. We should never think twice about whether we put a mezuzah on our door, or a kippah on our head, or the word Jewish on the facade of our institutions. And yet we may be moving in that direction. So we have to ask ourselves, each of us, all of us, what is our responsibility? We know that there are people who want to destroy the one and only Jewish majority nation on earth, and they couldn't care less who's the prime minister. Whether the prime minister comes from the center, the left, or the right, it doesn't matter. Israel is what matters to them, and they want it destroyed. And we know that when people went to a restaurant and said, "Who is a Jew?" they were not asking who is a Reformed Jew, and who is an agnostic Jew, and who is a cultural Jew, And who's an Orthodox Jew? They were looking for Jews. We know this. We have a responsibility, I believe. We have an opportunity to help shape the future of the Jewish people. Together with Israel, we comprise 90% of world Jewry. And so the question becomes, Bell, how do we express that? I happen to believe that AJC is the premier frontline global Jewish advocacy organization. I believe it, and we tried to display it over the last 4 days of this global forum. No, not all Jewish organizations are created alike, any more than all hospitals are alike or all universities are alike. If I tried to say to someone, you know, it doesn't matter whether you go to Princeton or Podunk, because they're all committed to education, people would laugh at me. And if I said it doesn't matter whether you go to the Mayo Clinic or whether you go to the local medical center, people would laugh at me. And I'm saying the same thing. The stakes couldn't be higher for the Jewish people, for the American Jewish community, for the global Jewish community, for the state of Israel. They couldn't be higher. We have to make informed decisions about where we spend our time and invest our efforts. And I believe at this critical moment in time, and you've seen it in the last 4 days with our programming, with the level of our speakers, with the depth of our content, that AJC is here for the long haul. We have made a difference. We are making a difference. And with the help of the people on this Zoom session, we can continue to make a difference and ensure that those 11 4- and 5-year-old children at the Chabad school graduation ceremony have a bright and secure future.
Thank you, David, for that powerful message and for your inspiring words. I think you've made it quite clear to our audience what's at stake, both for the Jewish people and for the world, for that matter. If you'd like to join us in our efforts in AJC's work, please make a donation to support us by going to ajc.org/give and to get involved today. I want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning into this session and really throughout this incredible week and for helping us to reimagine what's possible. We really do hope your journey with AJC will continue. Following Global Forum, we will continue offering our Advocacy Anywhere programming, AJC's free webinars that enable you to learn, engage, and advocate from wherever you are. And you can stay up to date on that programming by visiting ajc.org/advocacyanywhere. And finally, don't forget to save the date for next year's Global Forum, as David mentioned, which will be in Washington, D.C., in person, May 22nd through 24th, and more information to come. Thank you.